God's signs of the end are everywhere, but no one stops to see Jesus. Something is happening right now, and most people are too distracted to notice. The world feels louder, faster, heavier than ever before, yet deep inside, there is a silence that cannot be explained. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of disconnection, the kind that slowly pulls the soul away from what truly matters, while everything on the outside seems normal. Look around carefully. People are more connected than ever, yet conversations feel empty. Information is everywhere, yet wisdom feels rare. There is constant movement, constant noise, constant urgency, but very little direction. And in the middle of all of this, something sacred is being overlooked. Not because it is hidden, but because no one stops long enough to see it. Every day, signs are unfolding in plain sight. They are not distant or mysterious. They are woven into everyday life. In the way hearts are growing colder without explanation, in the way anxiety spreads even when there is no immediate danger, in the way people achieve more but feel less fulfilled. These are not random patterns. They are signals, quiet but persistent, pointing to something deeper that most are choosing to ignore. Here is where it becomes uncomfortable. It is not that people cannot see. It is that truly seeing would require them to stop, and stopping would force them to confront questions they have been avoiding. Questions about purpose, about truth, about eternity. Questions that cannot be answered with distractions. Because once you begin to see clearly, everything shifts. Your priorities change. Your perspective changes. Even your sense of identity begins to transform. And that level of change is something many are not ready to face. There was a time when people understood the value of stillness, when looking up was natural, when seeking God was not an afterthought but a necessity. Now, even when something feels off, the instinct is to fill the silence, to escape the discomfort, to move faster instead of going deeper. But what if the signs are not warnings meant to create fear? What if they are invitations? Invitations to pause, invitations to reflect, invitations to return. And what if, in the middle of all the chaos, there is still a voice calling out? Not competing with the noise, but patiently waiting for your attention. A voice that has never stopped, even when the world stopped listening. The question is not whether God is speaking. The evidence is everywhere. The real question is whether you are willing to step out of the noise even for a moment and truly listen. Because the moment you do, everything begins to change. Not on the outside first, but within you. And once that change begins, it becomes impossible to see the world the same way again. The silence of God in a noisy world. There is a question that echoes quietly in the minds of many, even if they rarely say it out loud. Why does God feel silent when the world is so loud? Why, in the middle of so much chaos, does heaven seem distant? It is a question that carries weight, because it touches something deeply personal, something that many have felt but struggle to explain. But what if the silence people feel is not coming from God? What if it is the result of everything else becoming too loud? Think about it. From the moment the day begins, the mind is flooded. Notifications, conversations, responsibilities, endless streams of content. There is always something demanding attention, something pulling focus away. And without realizing it, the soul becomes conditioned to noise. It adapts to constant stimulation and begins to resist stillness. And yet, throughout history, God has often spoken in moments of quiet. Not in the chaos, but in the pause. Not in the noise, but in the stillness. In 1st Book of Kings, chapter 19, verse 12, the presence of God was not in the wind, not in the earthquake, not in the fire, but in a still small voice. That pattern has not changed, but the environment around people has. The modern world has created a space where silence feels uncomfortable, where being alone with your thoughts feels unnatural, where stopping feels like falling behind. And in that environment, even if God is speaking, most will not hear him, not because he is absent, but because they are unavailable. This is where the shift happens. People begin to interpret their inability to hear as divine absence. They assume God has stepped back, when in reality, they have stepped away from the conditions where his voice is recognized. And over time, that perception becomes belief. The belief that God is distant, that he no longer speaks, that the connection is gone. But the truth is far more direct. The connection was never removed, it was drowned out. There is also something else happening beneath the surface. Noise does more than distract. It numbs. It fills every empty space where reflection could happen. And without reflection, there is no awareness. Without awareness, there is no recognition. And without recognition, even the clearest signs go unnoticed. This creates a cycle. The louder the world becomes, the less people hear. The less they hear, the more they assume nothing is being said. And the more they assume that, the less they seek. Until eventually, the silence they feel becomes normal. But it was never meant to be normal. Because the voice of God has not weakened. It has not faded. It has not disappeared. It remains steady, consistent, and present. The only thing that has changed is the environment in which people are trying to hear it. So the real question is not whether God is silent. The real question is this: when was the last time you allowed yourself to be still long enough to truly listen? Because if you remove the noise, even for a moment, you may realize something that changes everything. The silence you feared was never empty. It was waiting. The illusion of control in the modern age. One of the greatest deceptions of this generation is not open rebellion against God. It is the quiet belief that people can manage life well enough without him. That if they organize better, think faster, plan further, and protect themselves more carefully, they can stay in control of what happens next. It sounds reasonable. It feels mature. It even looks wise on the surface. But underneath that polished confidence, there is a fragile illusion that is breaking more people than they realize. Modern life trains people to trust systems, routines, strategies, and personal ability above everything else. Control has become a form of comfort. People want to know what comes next, how to avoid pain, how to secure their future, how to reduce uncertainty. They want guarantees in a world that has never promised any. And because that desire feels practical, many do not recognize the spiritual danger hiding inside it. The deeper problem is not planning. The deeper problem is dependence. There is a difference between being responsible and believing you are self-sufficient. There is a difference between wisdom and the refusal to surrender. Many people no longer seek God for direction because they have replaced surrender with management. They do not fall to their knees because they believe their own hands can carry what only God was meant to hold. That is why so many signs go unnoticed. A heart committed to control does not easily recognize divine interruption. When God allows discomfort, delay, uncertainty, or shaking, the controlled mind sees only disruption. It does not stop to ask whether heaven is trying to expose something deeper. It simply tries harder to restore order. It fights to regain balance. It works to rebuild the illusion. But God has never competed with human control. He often lets it run far enough for its weakness to be revealed. He allows people to discover that peace cannot be manufactured, that safety cannot be guaranteed, and that human strength has limits it cannot negotiate away. Not because he is cruel, but because false control must crack before true dependence can begin. This is why some of the clearest signs in a person's life do not look dramatic at first. A plan falls apart. A door closes. A relationship changes. A season becomes uncertain. The old confidence stops working. And instead of seeing that moment as spiritual exposure, many call it bad timing, misfortune, or stress. They miss the deeper message because they are still trying to repair the very thing God may be trying to dismantle. Scripture speaks directly to this. In the book of Proverbs, chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, the instruction is to trust in the Lord with all your heart and not lean on your own understanding. That command is not poetic decoration. It is a confrontation against the human instinct to place ultimate confidence in personal judgment. It challenges the very habit that defines modern life, and that habit is exhausting. The need to control everything leaves people mentally full and spiritually empty. They carry burdens they were never designed to carry. They monitor outcomes they cannot command. They fear what they cannot predict. Then they wonder why peace feels distant. Peace feels distant because control and surrender do not live comfortably in the same heart. This is where many people stand without knowing it. They are not rejecting God with their words. They are replacing Him with their posture. They say they believe, but they live as if everything depends on them. And when everything depends on you, Jesus becomes an idea instead of a refuge. That is why the signs of the times do not only appear in nations, systems, and headlines. They also appear in the restless soul that cannot release control. In the person who has mastered planning but forgotten trust. In the one who can explain every strategy but cannot rest in God for a single day. The illusion of control is powerful because it does not feel like rebellion. It feels like survival. But the longer a person clings to it, the harder it becomes to recognize the voice of Jesus. Control does not listen well. It calculates. It protects. It resists. It delays obedience until every outcome feels safe. And that is exactly why so many people remain spiritually blind while believing they are fully awake. Because the moment you admit you are not in control, another question rises with force. If you are not holding everything together, then what have you been missing while trying so hard to keep your life from falling apart? When the obvious becomes invisible. There is a strange phenomenon that happens when something is always present. The more familiar it becomes, the less attention it receives. What was once striking becomes ordinary. What once demanded focus fades into the background, and eventually, even what is most important can become invisible, not because it disappeared, but because it was seen too often without being truly noticed. This is exactly what is happening on a spiritual level. The signs are not hidden. They are not rare. They are not reserved for a select group of people searching in distant places. They are embedded in daily life, woven into ordinary moments, repeated in patterns that most people encounter constantly. And yet, because they are so close, so consistent, so familiar, they are overlooked. People are waiting for something dramatic, something undeniable, something impossible to ignore. They expect signs to break through the sky, to interrupt life in a way that forces attention. But many of the most significant signals do not arrive like that. They come quietly, repeatedly, persistently. And because they do not match expectations, they are dismissed. Look at what is happening around you. The increasing emptiness people feel even after achieving what they once desired. The growing difficulty to find peace in environments that should feel safe. The way relationships weaken under pressure. The way truth becomes harder to recognize in a world full of information. These are not random developments. They are indicators. They are revealing something deeper about the condition of the human heart and the direction of the world. But familiarity creates blindness. When people experience something repeatedly, they stop questioning it. They accept it as normal. Anxiety becomes normal. Disconnection becomes normal. Spiritual indifference becomes normal. And once something is normalized, it is no longer examined. It is simply lived with. This is where the danger intensifies. Because when the obvious becomes invisible, people stop searching. They stop asking deeper questions. They stop connecting what they see with what it might mean. They move through life reacting instead of discerning. And in that state, even the clearest spiritual signs fail to produce awareness. Jesus addressed this condition directly. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 13, verse 13, he spoke of those who see but do not perceive, who hear but do not understand. This was not a statement about physical blindness. It was about a deeper inability to recognize truth even when it is directly in front of them. That condition has not disappeared. If anything, it has intensified. The modern environment accelerates this blindness. People consume more information in a single day than previous generations did in weeks. Their attention is divided, fragmented, constantly shifting. And when attention is scattered, depth disappears. When depth disappears, recognition becomes shallow. And when recognition becomes shallow, meaning is lost. So people continue to see, but they do not perceive. They notice events, but they do not interpret them. They experience life, but they do not understand what it is pointing toward. And this is where something critical happens. Because when you stop recognizing the obvious, you also stop recognizing the one behind it. The patterns, the signals, the internal unrest, the external shifts, all of it is pointing somewhere. But if everything is treated as ordinary, then nothing leads to revelation. This is why many people can live surrounded by signs and still feel spiritually unchanged. Not because the signs are weak, but because their perception has been dulled by constant exposure without reflection. The truth is direct. Seeing is not the same as understanding. And being surrounded by truth does not guarantee that you will recognize it. But the moment you begin to question what you have been ignoring, something shifts. The ordinary starts to speak. The patterns start to connect. The things you once dismissed begin to reveal meaning. And that is when another realization begins to surface. If so much has been visible all along, then what else have you been overlooking that was never meant to be ignored? The faith that stays on the surface cannot sustain the gaze. There is a kind of faith that sounds right, looks acceptable, and feels comfortable, but it does not go deep enough to change anything. It agrees without surrendering. It listens without transforming. It acknowledges Jesus, but it does not truly see him. And because it remains on the surface, it cannot sustain the weight of truth when it finally comes into focus. Many people believe they have faith, but what they actually have is familiarity. They know the language, they recognize the stories, they understand the concepts. They can speak about God without hesitation. But when the moment comes to truly fix their eyes on Jesus, to face who he is and what he demands, something inside resists. The gaze does not hold. It shifts away. This is where the difference becomes clear. Surface faith is comfortable because it requires very little. It allows people to feel connected without being changed. It creates a sense of security without requiring surrender. It gives the impression of spiritual life while avoiding the cost of transformation. And as long as faith remains at that level, everything seems stable. But the moment truth becomes personal, everything changes. Because seeing Jesus is not a passive experience. It confronts, it exposes, it reveals what is hidden and challenges what is established. It does not adjust itself to fit a person's life. It calls the person to realign completely. And that level of clarity cannot be sustained by a shallow foundation. This is why many people look away. Not because they do not believe at all, but because their belief has never been deep enough to endure the reality of what they are seeing. When Jesus moves from idea to presence, from concept to authority, from distant figure to living truth, surface faith begins to collapse under the weight of that encounter. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 6, verses 46 through 49, Jesus speaks about those who hear his words but do not put them into practice. He compares them to someone building a house without a foundation. It stands for a while, but when pressure comes, it cannot hold. That is not just a warning. It is a description of what happens when faith remains shallow. And the pressure is already here. The world is shifting. Stability is being tested. Certainty is weakening. And in moments like these, shallow faith is exposed quickly. It cannot carry fear. It cannot answer deep questions. It cannot produce peace under pressure. So people begin to drift, not because they were never exposed to truth, but because they never built deeply enough to stand in it. There is also something more subtle happening. Surface faith tends to reshape Jesus into something manageable, something that does not disrupt, something that does not demand too much, a version that fits comfortably into existing patterns. But the real Jesus does not stay at the surface. He calls deeper, he challenges, he transforms. And that is where the tension rises. Because to truly see him, you cannot remain unchanged. To keep your eyes fixed on him, something in you must shift. Priorities must move, desires must be re-examined, control must be released. And for many, that cost feels too high, so they keep their faith at a safe distance. But distance has consequences. Because the longer faith remains superficial, the harder it becomes to recognize truth when it stands directly in front of you. The eyes may be open, but the heart is not prepared. And when the heart is not prepared, even a clear encounter with Jesus can be misunderstood, minimized, or avoided. This is why so many people claim belief but struggle to truly see. Their faith has never been stretched beyond comfort. It has never been anchored deeply enough to hold under the weight of revelation. But here is the turning point. The problem is not that deeper faith is unavailable. It is that it requires a decision most people keep postponing. The decision to move beyond familiarity. The decision to stop observing and start following. The decision to allow truth to reshape everything. Because once you choose to go deeper, something changes immediately. Your focus sharpens. Your perception shifts. And suddenly, what once felt distant becomes unmistakably real. And that raises a question that cannot be ignored. If surface faith cannot sustain the gaze, then what happens when life forces you to look deeper whether you feel ready or not? The exhaustion of the soul as a forgotten sign. There is a kind of tiredness that sleep cannot fix. It does not come from physical effort, and it does not disappear with rest. It lingers, it weighs down, it follows a person even in moments that should feel peaceful. This is not just fatigue, this is the exhaustion of the soul, and it is one of the most ignored signs of all. People have learned how to function while carrying it. They continue working, producing, interacting, achieving. From the outside, everything seems intact. But internally, something is draining slowly. Motivation weakens. Joy becomes inconsistent. Meaning feels distant. And instead of stopping to understand why, most try to manage the symptoms. They distract themselves. They consume more. They seek temporary relief in entertainment, in validation, in busyness. Anything that fills the gap for a moment. But the relief never lasts, because the problem is not external. It is deeper than that. The soul was never designed to live disconnected from its source. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, verses 28 through 30, Jesus invites the weary to come to him, promising rest for their souls. Not rest for the body, not rest for the schedule, but something far more profound. That invitation reveals something critical. The kind of exhaustion many people carry today is not solved by slowing down. It is solved by reconnecting. But instead of recognizing exhaustion as a signal, most interpret it as a personal limitation. They assume they need better balance, better habits, better strategies. They try to optimize their lives without addressing the root. And because of that, the exhaustion remains, quietly intensifying. This is where the sign is being missed. Because the exhaustion of the soul is not random. It is not meaningless. It is not just the result of a busy life. It is often a direct indication that something essential is missing. That the soul is carrying weight it was never meant to carry alone. That it is operating without the presence that gives it life. There is also a deeper layer to this. A tired soul does not perceive clearly. It becomes less sensitive, less attentive, less aware. It stops seeking depth because it no longer has the strength to go there. It settles for survival. And in that state, even when God is moving, even when signs are present, recognition becomes difficult. So exhaustion does not just weaken a person, it blinds them. And this creates a dangerous cycle. The more disconnected the soul becomes, the more exhausted it feels. The more exhausted it feels, the less it seeks what would restore it. And the less it seeks, the deeper the disconnection grows. All the while, the person believes they are simply tired. But what if that tiredness is trying to tell you something? What if the constant internal weight, the lack of peace, the quiet emptiness that no achievement seems to fill, is not a flaw in you, but a signal pointing beyond you? A signal that something is out of alignment. Because the soul recognizes what the mind tries to ignore. It feels the absence of what it was created to depend on. And when that connection is missing, no amount of external adjustment can compensate for it. This is why people can have everything they once wanted and still feel empty. Because the soul does not measure fulfillment the same way the world does. It does not respond to accumulation. It responds to connection. And until that connection is restored, the exhaustion remains. Not as punishment, but as a message. A message that refuses to disappear, no matter how much it is ignored. And that leads to a question that becomes harder to avoid with time. If the exhaustion you feel is not just tiredness, then what has your soul been trying to tell you that you have not stopped to hear? The culture of hurry and the loss of eternity. There is a pace that the world has accepted as normal, but it was never meant to be. Everything moves fast. Decisions are rushed. Time feels compressed. Days blur together. And in the middle of all that movement, something eternal is being quietly pushed aside. People are not just busy, they are constantly in a state of urgency. From the moment the day begins, there is pressure to respond, to produce, to keep up. Even moments that should be calm are filled with stimulation. Silence is replaced with noise. Waiting is replaced with scrolling. Reflection is replaced with reaction. And over time, the mind adapts to this rhythm until slowing down feels unnatural. But this pace comes with a cost, because eternity is not perceived in a hurry. Spiritual awareness requires space. It requires stillness. It requires moments where the mind is not occupied and the heart is not racing. Without that space, deeper perception becomes impossible, not because it is unavailable, but because it cannot compete with constant movement. This is why so many people feel disconnected without understanding why. They are moving too fast to notice what matters most. In the book of Psalms, chapter 46, verse 10, there is a direct instruction. Be still and know that I am God. That command is not symbolic. It is practical. It reveals that knowing God is connected to stillness. Not occasional stillness, but intentional pause. A decision to step out of motion long enough to recognize what is always present. But the culture of hurry resists that completely. It convinces people that slowing down means losing progress, that stopping means falling behind, that silence is unproductive. And because of that belief, many never allow themselves to pause long enough to see clearly. They keep moving, thinking they are gaining something, while quietly losing the ability to perceive what is eternal. And here is where it becomes more serious. When a person lives in constant urgency, their focus narrows to what is immediate, what needs to be done now, what needs to be solved today, what needs attention in this moment. And while that focus may seem efficient, it slowly removes any awareness of what goes beyond the present. Eternity fades from view, not because it stopped existing, but because there is no longer space to consider it. This is why even when signs appear, they are often dismissed. They require pause to be understood. They require reflection to be connected. But a hurried mind does not reflect. It reacts. It moves on. It looks for the next task, the next update, the next distraction. And in doing so, it misses what could have changed everything. There is also a deeper tension within this. Many people feel that something is missing, but they cannot identify what it is. They feel restless even when they are productive. They feel unsatisfied even when they are progressing. And the reason is simple. The human soul was not created to live only in the immediate. It was created with an awareness of eternity. But that awareness cannot survive in constant noise and speed. It requires intentional interruption. It requires moments where everything else is set aside, not because there is nothing to do, but because something more important needs to be seen. This is the part most avoid. Because slowing down does not just create space for peace, it also creates space for truth. And truth often reveals things people have been trying to outrun. Questions about purpose, questions about direction, questions about God. So instead of slowing down, they keep moving, not realizing that the faster they go, the further they drift from the very thing they are searching for. And this raises a critical question. If your life has no space to pause, no room for stillness, no moment for reflection, then how will you ever recognize something that does not rush, does not force itself, and waits patiently to be seen? The hardening of the heart in sensitive times. There is a paradox unfolding in the world that few people stop to examine. The more suffering increases, the less sensitive people become. The more pain is visible, the more normalized it feels. What should awaken compassion often produces indifference. What should lead to reflection is quickly dismissed. And over time, something inside the human heart begins to change. It becomes harder. Not all at once, not in a way that is immediately noticeable, but gradually, subtly, quietly. A person who once felt deeply begins to feel less. Situations that once caused concern no longer create the same response. The emotional weight of what is happening around them starts to fade, not because it matters less, but because the heart is adapting in the wrong direction. This is not strength. It is desensitization, and it is one of the clearest signs that something is spiritually misaligned. In the Gospel of Matthew chapter 24, verse 12, there is a warning that in the last days, the love of many will grow cold. That statement is not abstract. It describes exactly what happens when exposure to chaos, injustice, and disorder becomes constant. Instead of drawing people closer to truth, it can slowly distance them from it. Because when the heart hardens, perception changes. A hardened heart does not respond the same way. It does not pause. It does not reflect deeply. It does not seek understanding. It becomes resistant. It protects itself from feeling too much by feeling less. And while that may seem like a form of survival, it comes with a serious cost. It reduces the ability to recognize God. Because spiritual sensitivity and emotional sensitivity are connected. When one weakens, the other often follows. A heart that no longer feels deeply will struggle to discern deeply. It will overlook what requires attention. It will ignore what requires response. And it will remain unmoved by what should lead to transformation. This is why many people can witness significant events, personal struggles, and even internal emptiness without seeking something deeper. They have seen too much without processing it. They have felt too much without understanding it. So instead of engaging, they withdraw. They move forward, but without depth. And in that state, the signs continue to appear, but the response becomes weaker each time. What once might have led to reflection now leads to indifference. What once might have stirred a question now passes unnoticed. This is how spiritual blindness intensifies, not through complete rejection, but through gradual hardening. There is also something else happening beneath the surface. A hardened heart does not just ignore truth. It begins to resist it. It avoids anything that might soften it again. It rejects moments that require vulnerability. It turns away from anything that might expose what has been buried. And because of that resistance, even when Jesus is present, even when his call is clear, the response remains distant. Not because he is unclear, but because the heart is closed. But here is what makes this moment critical. The hardening of the heart is not irreversible. It is progressive, which means it can also be interrupted. But that interruption requires awareness. It requires honesty. It requires a willingness to recognize that something has changed internally. Because once you acknowledge that your response is no longer what it used to be, a new question emerges. When did you stop feeling the weight of what truly matters? And if the heart has grown cold over time, then what has it been exposed to repeatedly without stopping to understand? Because the answer to that question may reveal more than you expect. The search for answers in the wrong places. There is a deep hunger inside every person, whether they admit it or not. A need to understand, to find meaning, to make sense of what they feel and what they see. But the problem is not the hunger. The problem is where people are trying to satisfy it. Because the search has not stopped. It has just been redirected. People are still looking for answers. They are just looking in places that were never designed to provide them. They search in success, in relationships, in recognition, in knowledge, in endless content. They look for something that explains the emptiness, something that stabilizes their thoughts, something that gives them a sense of direction. And for a moment it seems like it works, but it never lasts. Because temporary sources cannot provide permanent clarity. This is where many begin to feel the tension. They invest time, energy, and attention into things that promise fulfillment, but the result is always incomplete. The answers feel partial. The peace feels unstable. The clarity fades quickly, and instead of questioning the source, most people simply search harder. They move to the next thing, the next idea, the next experience, not realizing they are repeating the same pattern. In the Gospel of John, chapter 4, verses 13 and 14, Jesus speaks about this directly. He explains that whoever drinks from the water of this world will thirst again, but whoever receives what he offers will never thirst in the same way. That is not just a spiritual metaphor. It is a direct explanation of why so many people feel stuck in a cycle of searching without finding. They are drawing from sources that cannot sustain them, and because of that, even when real answers are near, they are often overlooked. Not because they are hidden, but because attention is already occupied. The mind is full. The focus is divided. The search is constant, but it lacks direction. This creates a dangerous illusion, the illusion of progress. People feel like they are moving forward because they are always learning something new, experiencing something new, trying something new. But movement is not the same as direction, and information is not the same as truth. So they continue searching, but without ever arriving. There is also a deeper resistance involved, because finding real answers often requires letting go of false ones. It requires admitting that what you trusted did not work, that what you relied on was incomplete. And that kind of realization is uncomfortable. It challenges identity, it disrupts patterns, it forces change. So instead of confronting that, many choose to keep searching in familiar places, even if those places have already failed them. This is why the signs are missed again. Because when a person is committed to the wrong source, they interpret everything through that lens. They filter reality based on what they already believe. And in doing so, they dismiss what does not fit, even if it carries truth. So Jesus can be present, the invitation can be clear, the signs can be consistent, and still the response is delayed. Not because the answer is unclear, but because the search is misdirected. And over time, that misdirection becomes a habit, a pattern of looking everywhere except where the answer has always been. But eventually, a moment comes when the pattern begins to break, when the repetition becomes obvious, when the search starts to feel empty instead of hopeful. And in that moment, a different question begins to rise. If everything you have been searching for has not satisfied you, then why are you still looking in the same places? The fear of seeing what demands change. There is a moment that many people quietly avoid, even without realizing it. It is the moment when truth becomes clear enough that it can no longer be ignored. Not vague, not distant, not theoretical, but personal, direct, unavoidable. And in that moment, something deeper than doubt begins to rise. Fear. Not fear of being wrong, but fear of what will have to change if they are right. Because seeing Jesus clearly is not just a spiritual experience, it is a turning point. It confronts identity. It challenges priorities. It exposes what has been hidden. And most importantly, it demands a response. Not later, not when it feels convenient, but now. This is why many people remain on the edge of clarity without stepping into it. They sense something is real. They feel something is calling. They recognize patterns, signs, internal unrest. But instead of moving closer, they hesitate. They slow down. They look away. Not because they lack evidence, but because they understand what that evidence implies. Change. Real change is costly. It affects how a person lives, thinks, decides, and relates. It requires letting go of habits that once felt normal. It requires releasing control, confronting truth, and walking in a direction that may not feel comfortable at first. And even though that path leads to life, the entrance to it often feels narrow. In the Gospel of John, chapter 3, verses 19 and 20, it is written that light has come into the world, but people loved darkness instead of light because their deeds were exposed. That is not a condemnation. It is an explanation. It reveals that avoidance is not always about disbelief. Sometimes it is about protection. People protect the version of life they have built. They protect their routines, their choices, their sense of control. And when truth threatens to disrupt that, resistance appears. Not always openly, but internally, quietly, in hesitation, in delay, in distraction. This is where the fear operates most effectively. It does not always say no. It simply says not now. Not now to change. Not now to surrender. Not now to fully see. And that delay feels harmless, but over time, it creates distance. Because every postponed response weakens the urgency of the moment. And the longer that continues, the easier it becomes to live without acting on what was once clear. There is also another layer to this fear. Seeing Jesus means letting go of the illusion that you can remain the same. It means accepting that life cannot continue unchanged. And for many, that feels like losing something, even if what they are holding on to is already empty. So they stay where they are, not because they are satisfied, but because they are familiar, and familiarity feels safer than transformation. But here is the truth that cannot be avoided. Avoiding change does not preserve your life. It only delays what is inevitable, because the signs will not stop. The call will not disappear. The truth will not fade just because it is ignored. It will remain steady and present, waiting for a response. And eventually, the question becomes unavoidable. How long can you continue to see without responding? Because there comes a point where clarity itself becomes a responsibility. And once you reach that point, standing still is no longer neutral. It becomes a decision. The disconnection between information and revelation. Never has there been so much access to knowledge, and yet never has there been so little true understanding. People know more, read more, hear more, consume more than any generation before. Information flows constantly, endlessly, without interruption. And still, something essential is missing. Because information is not the same as revelation. A person can know about God and still not know Him. They can understand concepts, memorize verses, follow teachings, and yet remain unchanged internally. They can explain truth without ever experiencing it. And that gap, the space between what is known and what is lived, is where many people are quietly stuck. It feels like progress, but it is not transformation. This is one of the most subtle and dangerous conditions. Because when someone has information, they often believe they have arrived. They feel secure in what they know. They feel confident in what they can explain. But knowledge alone does not open spiritual eyes. It does not soften the heart. It does not create surrender. Revelation does. In the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 16, verse 17, Jesus tells Peter that what he understood about him was not revealed by flesh and blood, but by the Father in heaven. That moment shows something critical. True recognition of Jesus is not the result of accumulated information. It is the result of divine revelation that reaches beyond the mind and touches the heart. And that kind of revelation cannot be manufactured. It requires openness. It requires humility. It requires a willingness to move beyond analysis and into surrender. But in a world driven by knowledge, many remain at the level of understanding without ever stepping into experience. They learn, but they do not encounter. And because of that, they remain unchanged. This is why so many people can hear the same message repeatedly without it affecting them. It enters the mind, but it does not penetrate deeper. It is processed, categorized, and stored, but not lived. And over time, familiarity with truth creates the illusion of connection to it. But illusion cannot sustain transformation. There is also a deeper issue hidden here. Information can be controlled. It can be managed, interpreted, debated. A person can engage with it without allowing it to challenge them. But revelation is different. It interrupts, it confronts, it exposes, it demands a response that cannot be avoided. And that is exactly why many people stay at the level of information. Because revelation changes everything. It removes the distance between knowing and responding. It eliminates excuses. It brings clarity that requires action. And for someone who is not ready to change, that level of clarity feels overwhelming. So they continue to learn. They continue to listen. They continue to gather more information. But they avoid the moment where that knowledge becomes personal. This is where the disconnection grows. Because the more information a person has without revelation, the more they believe they are close, when in reality, they may still be far. They can describe truth without recognizing it. They can speak about Jesus without truly seeing Him. And that is why the signs are missed again. Not because they are unclear, but because they are being processed intellectually instead of spiritually. But the moment revelation enters, everything shifts. What was once distant becomes immediate. What was once theoretical becomes real. What was once optional becomes urgent. And in that moment, a new question rises with weight. If knowing is not enough, then what has been missing in everything you thought you understood? The subtle invitation that never stopped. There is something many people misunderstand about God. They expect His voice to compete with the world, to interrupt loudly, to force attention. But that is not how He has chosen to move. His invitation has never depended on volume. It has always depended on willingness. And that invitation has never stopped. Not for a moment. Even now, in the middle of distraction, noise, confusion, and spiritual distance, it is still present, consistent, patient, unchanging, not weakened by time, not silenced by culture, not affected by how often it is ignored. But it is subtle, not because it is weak, but because it is intentional. God does not force himself into a life that refuses to pause. He does not override the will of someone determined to look away. Instead, he calls, repeatedly, quietly, faithfully, in ways that require attention, not urgency. This is why so many miss it. They are waiting for something undeniable, something impossible to overlook. But the invitation often comes in moments that seem ordinary. A sudden awareness that something is not right. A question that lingers longer than expected. A sense that there must be more. A moment of stillness that feels different from all others. These are not coincidences. They are interruptions of grace. In the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verse 20, there is a clear image. Jesus stands at the door and knocks. He does not break the door. He does not force entry. He knocks and waits. That image reveals the nature of his approach. Persistent, but not intrusive. Present, but not overwhelming. And that changes everything. Because it means the responsibility to respond does not lie in hearing something louder. It lies in choosing to recognize what is already being said. There is also a deeper tension here. The longer a person ignores the invitation, the easier it becomes to overlook it. Not because it disappears, but because sensitivity to it decreases. Just like any repeated signal that is ignored, it begins to blend into the background. And what was once noticeable becomes easy to miss. But it never stops. Even in moments of distraction, it remains. Even in seasons of distance, it continues. Even when a person has turned away multiple times, the invitation is still extended again. This is what many fail to understand. God's persistence is not loud, but it is relentless. He does not abandon the call. He does not withdraw the invitation because it was ignored. He continues, knowing that at any moment, a person may finally pause long enough to respond. And when that moment comes, everything changes. Because the invitation is not just to observe, it is to enter. To move from distance to relationship. From awareness to surrender. From seeing signs to recognizing the one behind them. But here is the question that begins to press in. If the invitation has never stopped, then how many times have you felt it and dismissed it without realizing what it was? Because recognizing that may lead to something unavoidable. The realization that you have never truly been without direction, only unwilling to follow it. When someone finally stops to see, there comes a moment that changes everything, and it does not begin with noise. It begins with a pause, a real pause. Not a break filled with distraction, not a temporary silence, but a deliberate decision to stop and truly look. Most people never reach this moment, not because it is unavailable, but because it requires something they have been avoiding the entire time. Stillness, honesty, surrender. But when someone finally stops, the shift is immediate. What once felt distant becomes present. What once seemed unclear begins to make sense. The patterns, the signs, the internal unrest, the questions that never fully went away, everything starts to align. Not because something new appeared, but because for the first time, they are actually seeing. And what they see is not just the world differently. They see Jesus. Not as an idea, not as a concept learned over time, not as something they heard about in passing, but as reality, as presence, as truth that was always there, waiting to be recognized. In that moment, everything else loses its illusion of importance. The noise that once dominated fades into the background. The urgency that once controlled every decision loses its power. The need to hold everything together begins to loosen. Because when you finally see clearly, you realize something that changes your entire perspective. You were never meant to carry life alone. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 39 through 42, there is a moment where Mary chooses to sit at the feet of Jesus while everything else demands attention. She stops. She listens. She focuses. And Jesus makes it clear that what she chose was the one thing that truly mattered. That moment still exists. but very few choose it. Because stopping feels risky. It feels like stepping out of everything that once defined progress. It feels like letting go of control, of speed, of distraction. But in reality, it is the only place where clarity begins. And once clarity begins, there is no returning to blindness. Because seeing Jesus changes more than perception. It changes direction. It changes desire. It changes identity. The things that once satisfied begin to lose their hold. The patterns that once felt normal begin to feel empty. And a new awareness takes their place. An awareness that you cannot ignore anymore. This is the turning point. Not when the signs appear, but when someone finally responds to them. Not when the world becomes louder, but when someone chooses to step out of the noise. Not when truth is spoken, but when it is received. And from that moment forward, everything is different. Not because life becomes easier, but because it becomes clear. Clear enough to follow. Clear enough to trust. Clear enough to surrender. Because once you truly see Jesus, the question is no longer whether the signs are real. The question becomes whether you will continue walking as if you have not seen him. And that is a question no one else can answer for you.